Good evening, everyone. Thanks for sticking with me through that technical difficulty for just a quick moment. We are seeing a few more people just jump on, so I'll start the webinar in just a few short minutes. Alrighty, everyone, we'll make a start. Again, thank you for sticking with us through that technical difficulty. I'm not sure what happened, but it looks like we're good to go, and so we will. So welcome everyone to the start of the webinar series for this year. Good evening, thanks for being here. We are back in 2021 after a massive response from our webinars last year. To introduce myself, my name is Jake. I came for a few of them last year, and I'm here and ready to go again. So to start with, in 2021, let's hope that it is a dramatically different year to 2020. But I do expect that there will be a few more curveballs coming this year, hopefully none quite so serious as last year. But essentially what we've done is we've designed this webinar series again for you to provide some guidance and some clarity around supporting your child or supporting your children. And so whether your child is in year 7 or in year 12, they'll probably hear from one of our presenters at some point during their high schooling life. What we at Elevate do is we help students with study skills and with work habits so that they can achieve their best. And that's exactly why we're here tonight, but through a slightly different lens. So tonight, what the purpose is to give you some insight into how you can help your child at home. And of course, if there's any students watching, welcome. These tips are obviously for you as well. So for tonight, the agenda is going to be that I'll provide a little bit of a context, a little bit of background about who Elevate is and what we do. I'm going to take a very small tangent away from the main focus of today's webinar, and I will provide some tips on remote learning. The reason is when we first delivered this webinar back in August, it was just when the stage 4 lockdown was being introduced into Victoria. And as a Victorian myself, we certainly do not need another one of those. But there were some really good tips that came out of that, and they can be applied to other parts of our study lives. And so I just want to go over those because I really do think they're too good not to put in this. But the majority of the webinar, as it says there, is going to be on motivation, which of course parents ask us about all the time, but definitely at the start of the year and then also at the end of the year. And after that, as we do with every webinar, we'll have a Q&A at the end where I can answer any of your questions that come up, either if you've got them right now or throughout the course of the evening. So with that in mind, let me direct you to where you can ask your questions. If you've made it to the Elevate website, in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen should be a little pink chat bubble. If you can open that, that should open up your chat box for you. We have a fantastic and ready to go team back in Sydney at HQ, ready to get all of your questions and feed them through to me so I can answer them here in Victoria. If you're on YouTube, on the right-hand side of the screen, just next to the video, should also be a chat box. And we're monitoring that as well, so we can get your questions. And again, you can feed them through to me. But also, you'll need that chat box because I will be asking you some questions throughout the course of the night. And therefore, I can get some of your answers and see what you guys are thinking. And the final thing that I just want to mention before I jump into tonight's webinar is that you may have already noticed that I am not a parent. It is certainly on my to-do list at some point, but for the moment, that's not me. And so I'm not here to tell you how to parent your child from that particular viewpoint, but rather what we are here to Elevate is we're study skills experts. So what I'm going to tell you about is what all of our 20 years of research, what all the neuroscience and all the neuro research says about these study skills, and in particular about how to motivate teenagers. So with that in mind, let's jump straight into it. And I want to start with a little bit of background about Elevate Education. So we were founded in 2001 by Douglas Barton, and we started with a core question. And the question we wanted to ask was, what is it that the top students are doing that allows them to get the top marks? And at that time, the most common heuristic that everybody was using was IQ. That is that if you are a smart student, you'll do well. And if you're a dumb student, you won't do well. But we didn't quite think that was the whole picture. So we set out to understand more and exactly what it was that the top students were doing in order to get those top marks. So we interviewed well over 1,000 students and we wanted to understand their approach to their work. So where did they study? Did they take notes? Did they do practice questions? Did they set goals? Things like that. And then what we did is we took about 100 of those students and we borderline interrogated them for a more detailed picture. So if they said they used color in their notes, we would ask them what colors they were using. Why were they using colors? Where did they put their colors? If they were using a desk, what kind of desk? How long were they sitting at that desk? Where did they put their desk? What's on their desk? All of these really specific qualitative type questions. And what we found was that there's 13 habits or 13 key study skills that these students were using that allowed them to differentiate themselves from the rest of the cohort. And now we work with over 800,000 students across 3,000 different schools across Australia, UK, USA, Singapore, and South Africa. And that allows us to consistently and constantly benchmark the best student practice. And then we take all those skills and we take that best practice and we share them. We share them through seminars at schools, we share them in private coaching programs, working one-on-one with families, and more recently, we share them with students talking via Zoom. And the important premise about Elevate is that all of our staff, all of our coaches and our presenters are young. And the reason we have that is we have that younger messenger that's closer in age to these students, that speaks their language. They're delivering a research-driven message, which means that that message can finally hit home. We create these conditions where we get that penny drop moment, where things fall into place and a student says, oh my gosh, it makes sense. And they run out of their room and they say, Mum, Dad, I learned something new. And of course, it is exactly what you've been telling them the entire time. So, moving on to tonight, what are we going to do? Well, study skills are just like any skills. Riding a bike, cooking, playing a musical instrument. Skills are repeated, or rather they are perfected through repetition and through review. And while schools do a really fantastic job at introducing study skills to students, if we want it to become a habit, we need to ensure regular practice. And so these skills are more likely to be practiced if they're constantly reinforced, yes, by teachers, but of course also by parents. So my purpose tonight is to empower you as parents to reinforce these study skills in your home and ensure that they then become habitual. Now, as I mentioned before, we have 13 skills. So why would we start with motivation? Well, it's a very important skill to be helping out with at the moment, because it's all well and good if these students have effective time management skills or they're great at note taking, but if a student doesn't feel like walking over to the desk and opening their book, then all of those great time management skills, all those great note taking skills are a bit wasted, and they might be practically meaningless if they're not going to do anything. So motivation will serve as the topic for tonight, but we certainly won't stop there. In 2 weeks' time, on the 24th of February, there will be another webinar on when we will go into some of that time management stuff. We'll talk about organization, planning assignments, and the ability to avoid procrastination. So before I jump into the motivation stuff, if you're on our website, there is a box for you to sign up for that webinar in 2 weeks' time, if that's something you're interested in. Just below the video, there should be a little box for you to put your email address in. And so as soon as we have that link and as soon as we have that webinar set up, you will also have that link. And if you're on the YouTube page, that is also okay. In the description should be a link to that same registration form. Okay, all right. So like I said, one quick tangent about working from home because it's really just too good to miss. So like I said, Kane delivered this in August last year as we headed into stage 4, and hopefully nothing like that ever happens again. But this is a really nice tip about structuring your time at home. Now, if you feel like this isn't relevant to you, that is totally okay. You can take a quick 2-minute break. You can put your favorite TV show on, feed the dog, pour yourself a glass of wine, whatever it is. Come back in 2 minutes, and then we'll get back into the other stuff. But like I said, this is also really good for anyone who's going to be working at home during the holidays. So, remote learning is scary. And the good news is that if we ever have to be in that situation again, if it ever pops up again, we've got a few tips and tricks to kind of stay on top of it. We can remove some of that uncertainty that we first had. Now, despite having that, it's still really hard for a lot of students. And the reason that it's so tough is because as soon as students leave the school grounds, we lose one of the major benefits of school, and that is structure. Because school tells us where to be, when we should be there, what we need to be learning, and how we should be learning it. But at home, none of these are givens. And so students have to make their own judgments and their own assessments of what they should be doing and when. And the key thing that we're trying to avoid here is called willpower depletion, which is a concept proposed by a psychologist called Roy Baumeister. And essentially what Roy said was that humans have a finite amount of willpower every single day. And the choices that we make or the temptations that we resist wear that willpower down. Or put a little bit simply, there is a finite number of good choices that we can make per day. And a really easy example is dieting. So you wake up, you feel good, you've got lots of willpower, you eat a healthy breakfast, you go to work, you eat a healthy lunch, you come home, you work out, but then by 9 o'clock, your willpower might have depleted, and that's when we go to the freezer, and that's when we eat the full tub of ice cream. You're much more likely to see someone do that at the end of the day rather than at 9 a.m., because at 9 a.m., you've got more willpower. So, how do we overcome this problem? If it is choices and temptations that wear down willpower, then the answer is to remove the choices. And a really good example of someone who did this was Steve Jobs. So when he was still with us, he wore the same outfit every single day. It was the black turtleneck, the blue jeans, and those sneakers. And so when he was getting dressed in the morning, he could cruise through that process on autopilot, not thinking about it, which allowed his mind to think about more important things. So, applying this to school, we need to see where the choices are that students have to make. That is, what to study and when to study it. So as you can see, the tip on the screen here is to mirror the school week. So if you're working from home and your child usually has a 50-minute math lesson at 10 a.m. on Monday, that's when they do maths, and they do it for 50 minutes. And then if they usually have a break to get to their next class, let's say 5 minutes, then we encourage them to get up, get away from the desk, walk around the block, around the house, whatever it is, come back and sit down for their next class, which let's say might be history. They study that for 50 minutes, and then they take a break. If lunch goes from, let's say, 1:15 till 2 p.m., then we encourage students to spend that same 45 minutes doing similar things to what they would be doing at school. So if it's talking to their friends and, they are at their home, they can use Zoom, FaceTime, Google Hangouts, conference calls, whatever. If they usually go and, kick the footy around, then of course encourage them to go meet one of their friends at the park, kick the footy around, come back for 2 p.m. when class resumes. So one of the main benefits of something like this is that there are really well-designed timetables. The school has a perfect allocation of time so that all the subjects that are being done have a perfect balance. Everything is perfectly balanced, just as it should be. And it's easy to wake up and know exactly what you are doing without having to worry about it. So, like I said, hopefully we don't ever find ourselves in the same situation. But if you feel like something is kind of stressing you out or something similar is happening, then I have 2 final bits of advice for working from home. The first one is about regular check-ins. And so having a regular check-in with your child can be really useful to provide a supportive interaction. So for example, you might say before school, at lunch, and after school, we're just going to check in and cover the core priorities of the day. What are we learning? Why are we learning it? And like I said, it's a really invaluable supportive interaction that they usually get from their teachers, but might not if they're working from home. And then secondly, there are other resources out there. So one of the things that we'll cover today is Elevate's online mentors and coaches that can work one-to-one with your child and keep them on track while they're getting through this year or any other year really. So a quick recap: mirror the school week to eliminate choices, keep our willpower up for the more important parts of the day. And because the other key thing that school provides is someone standing over them all the time, making sure they're getting their work done, students will eventually lose that person standing over them when they do come home. Which leads me nicely into the rest of tonight's topic, which of course is motivation. Because once we lose that, students at some point will need to be able to motivate themselves to get work done. Okay, so into the content for tonight. We're going to start this journey by taking stock of where we're at the moment. And so what I'll get you to do is to write down these 3 questions. Whether it's on a notepad, a scrap piece of paper, a Word document, whatever is handy, write these down. Because I would like you to reflect on these as we go through tonight's content and answer them, of course, if you can right now. And I want you to see whether some new ideas come to light or if these are things you haven't really thought about before. So the first question, how does motivation apply to your own life? When we've run this webinar before, parents often find it useful to consider how these tips might apply to their own life and then to give them a crack before passing them on to their kids. And one piece of advice that we always give is try these skills alongside your kids because it makes everything way easier. Question number 2, what have you previously tried to get your child motivated? What is it that you think will actually get your teenager moving or working? And then question number 3, what strategies do you need to implement in order to get them working more effectively at home? So, at the crux of our discussion tonight is the fact that at some point, independent learning is always going to be required, and it is really important that we know how to get this stuff done. So, to start with, let's talk about motivation as a concept, which is often a very misunderstood and unfortunately an oversimplified concept. Because people will often see motivation as an external force. It's something that we can throw at our kids to push them, not literally, in the right direction. So we'll try and find our external sources in movies or in books or in YouTube videos or Spotify playlists. And if that doesn't work, then we'll dangle the carrot. So we'll say something like, if you do your work, you can have $20. And if that doesn't work, then we wave the stick. Do your work or I'll throw your Xbox out. So, for question number 2 that I just asked, how do you motivate your teenager? Did anyone write something like this? And if so, I can tell you, and I'm sure you can probably tell me too, because you are listening to an online webinar about how to motivate your child, that while these things might work, they don't work for very long, maybe a few hours. And so if they don't work, what is going to work? And the answer is goals. Research shows that students that have clarity around their goals, the most clarity around their goals, why they have set them, are the most motivated students. However, the problem we have with goals is that the process of goal setting is often so oversimplified that people don't get it right. Because people think it often works like this on the screen, that they set a goal, therefore that will motivate them, therefore they will work hard, and therefore they'll get results. But alas, the reality is actually much more complicated than that. And what we've found is that some goals actually decrease levels of motivation. And a really good example of this is if you're at work, let's say your boss sets you a budget or a KPI or a target that is so out of reach. What effect does that have on you? Most probably, you give up, you stop caring, and you take a 2-hour lunch break. So the important factor here is setting the right goals in the right context. And we're going to look at both of those things. But firstly, let's have a look at what the right goals are to set. Now, for anyone interested in doing more research on goals and the impact that they have, what I'm about to go through is based on the work by Andrew Elliott and by Mary Church. They wrote a paper called the Hierarchical Model of Motivation. And this paper obviously has their own work, but also draws upon finding from psychologists like David McClelland, Carol Dweck, Martin Seligman, just to name a few. But instead of going into in depth as to how their model works, I'm just going to pull out some key parts, the parts that I think are most relevant to teenagers and most relevant to you as parents helping them. But I know some of you will be keen to do more research, and so I will repeat those names for you. So Andrew Elliott, Mary Church, David McClelland, Carol Dweck, and Martin Seligman. Okay, so there are 3 types of goals that we have. They are avoidance goals, performance goals, and mastery goals. And we're going to start with avoidance goals. So, an avoidance goal is when we are trying to avoid the worst possible outcome. And so these are goals like don't come last, don't fail, don't get laughed at. And they are set for one of 2 reasons. Either students are scared of failure because achieving something like don't fail is way easier than get a B+, or students have very low levels of self-belief in their own ability to achieve. And that could be for a number of reasons. Perhaps they had a few bad results recently, perhaps they feel like they're behind on their work or they're tired, but whatever it is, students set the bar really low because they don't think they'll do well. And absolutely, these are the wrong types of goal because we find that students that set avoidance goals have very low intrinsic motivation. The goal is easy to achieve, it doesn't require effort, plus students have low enjoyment of their goals because the framing is negative. And thus we find that people have a tendency to underperform when they're setting avoidance goals. So performance goals are the next ones, and these are goals that demonstrate relative competence when it comes to a particular test or a particular occasion. A good example from the workplace is KPIs, scales, customer metrics, or for students, I want to get 80% in the next test. I want to get the top mark in the class. I want to get straight A's across all my subjects. I want to get an ATAR of 89. Now, these goals absolutely have a place, and they are often the goals that students and parents think should be set all the time. However, we actually need to use these quite sparingly. And let's have a look at why that is. Because on the plus side, they generally make teens very motivated. Students will study diligently, they'll put in a significant amount of work, they will make their notes, they will go through the hard slog of memorizing stuff, and as a result, they will get good grades. However, while they're doing it, they don't enjoy doing it. And I think we can all probably relate to that at some point you have worked really hard at something and you absolutely smashed that, but by George, it was a slog, and you don't enjoy it. And it's the exact same for a teenager. They probably don't rush to their desk with excitement when they're going to study because it's a chore. They'll do it, but they don't like it. And because they don't enjoy it, their intrinsic motivation, which is their enjoyment of and their interest in the activity for its own sake, is low. So what that means is that once the goal goes away, once they pass the test, the motivation disappears too. It's gone. And if you've ever seen one of our parent seminars, these are the type of students that we like to call flatliners, or I call them QRS complexes for anyone a little bit more familiar with ECGs, because their motivation spikes like a heart rate monitor before the test, and then afterwards it goes straight back down to zero. So, to summarize, they'll get it done, but they see learning as a chore. And so they'll only work when they really have to. Otherwise, they're not keen and they'll opt out. Now, like I said, performance goals can be the right goals, but they're not always the right goals. The final type of goal that we want to talk about is mastery goals. Now, unlike performance goals, where we're focusing on a certain relative performance-based outcome, the mastery goals are on achieving mastery of a particular skill just for learning's sake. So, a few examples, something like have a 5-minute conversation by the end of the year with a native Dutch speaker in Dutch. In art, it might be an improved ability to draw facial features so they feel more lifelike with my drawings. Or it might be working at my assessments more consistently so that by the end of the term, it's not a whirlwind of stress. Or it might be writing better essay introductions. And when we look at the outcomes of these mastery goals, the outcome is more positive, which means that intrinsic motivation is high because the fear of failure is gone. There is nothing to lose. If your goal is to improve and there is any small degree of improvement, then you've made it. That's awesome. And then secondly, enjoyment is high. Teens who set goals like this tend to enjoy the process of learning because they are sufficiently challenged to stay interested, but we're not racked by a fear of failure, which lands us in that sweet spot where learning is actually fun. However, there is a catch, and that is that the research on how mastery goals impact academic performance is pretty mixed. So half of the literature says that they lead to significant improvements in academic performance, and the other half says that they don't. And there are other researchers, including Carol Dweck, who go a bit further, and she argues that if you have someone who only sets mastery goals, it can lead to a poorly adapted teenager that can't cope with high-pressure situations in the workplace, where performance goals like financial targets are simply unavoidable. So, that leads us to a big question, of course: what are the right goals to set? And the answer is going to be a combination of performance and mastery goals. Now, I would recommend that you start with mastery. The reason is they're easier to achieve. And when a student starts to see progress and to experience those small wins, their self-efficacy and their self-belief also increases. Which means that when an assessment or an exam comes along and they need to get something more specific down, they won't gravitate towards avoidance goals, but they'll be more keen to challenge themselves and set a good performance goal. Of course, like I mentioned, when the test does come around, we encourage students, we encourage your children to set performance goals. And then once that test passes, we put that performance goal behind us and we come up with a new mastery goal so that we can stay motivated long term. So, like I said, the right goals are important, but they also need to be in the right context. So how on earth do we go about setting these goals? And there's 4 tips I want to talk through. The first one, as you can see there, is start with why. Equally as important as helping your children, our students, set goals is to build that clarity around them. Students need to understand exactly what their goals mean, why they have chosen them, because otherwise it falls apart. And there's a great example of a student that we know called Doug, who at the start of year 12 decided that his goal was going to be to study law. But Doug didn't really know why he wanted to study law. And if he was honest with himself looking back, it's because when he got to the end of year 12, he thought it would be cool to be able to say, I'm going to study law. And so because there's no real clarity or attachment to that goal, what happened to Doug was that as the stress built about halfway through the year, it's a really intense time, everything fell apart. Because he didn't know why he wanted to study it, he didn't really care about it, and as a result, he lost motivation. The problem is that students will set goals just for the sake of having them without really knowing why, and just like with Doug, the wheels fall off the wagon and it all falls apart. So, for a goal to be compelling, a student should be able to tell you about it. And a great example for one of our coaching programs is after the goal setting module, we had a student who told us that she wanted to study vet science at Sydney Uni because it was the most esteemed course of its kind in Australia. She loved animals and her dream job was to breed racehorses. And so how you can help as a parent to encourage this sort of clarity is two things. Firstly, discuss your kids' goals with them. Ask them why they have set them. So for example, if they said they want to study engineering, ask them why. Ask them what they expect to learn from engineering, what jobs they expect to be able to do in the future, what skills they'll acquire. And this helps them to establish clarity. And the second thing is to help them gain a more in-depth and precise understanding of exactly what their goals involve. And I recognize that this is a little bit more attuned to year 10 to 12 students who have uni, TAFE or college kind of looming on the horizon. But a great place to start is with faculty handbooks, which are downloadable from all of the uni websites. And what they are is a book that contains a list with every single subject that a student will study in each of their degrees. And it then goes forth to provide a description of each one of those subjects and what content is covered. And like I said, these are accessible from every uni website, but it helps these students build context and clarity for each of their goals. All right, moving into tip number 2, make goals specific. The number one mistake we find students make when setting goals is they make something called an S goal. Now, an S goal is one of those things where you take a multiple of 10 and put an S on the end. So I want to get in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s. And what we have found in our research is that the brain actually crosses out the S. So if your goal is, I want to get in the 70s, what students tend to get is 70 or 71 or 69. And in fact, that student is highly capable of getting 78 or 79, and probably that's what they actually want. But they don't have the courage to admit it. And so as a result, they set their S goals, they get their 70, and they score much lower than they probably could have if they just changed their goal or made it a bit more specific. So, for performance goals, drop the S, be specific, pick a number. All right, moving into tip number 3, make sure it is attainable. And I feel like that one's pretty self-explanatory because if a goal is out of reach, you are simply just never going to run at it. And the final tip for goals is to write it down. Our lives are so busy and humans are really, really good at forgetting stuff, as I'm sure you'll agree with me. So if we don't write things down, we forget them. And goals are the exact same. Students should write down their goals, they should make them visual, and they should put them everywhere. Because if you can have a constant visual reminder, you'll be constantly reminded as to why you are working hard. So what we encourage students to do, for example, is write it on a sticky note, write it on a couple of sticky notes, put them all over their desk or their room, their study area, their house. They can laminate them, put them on the shower door. In the early years of Elevate, we even heard of a student who got his goal ATAR on a custom license plate. Whatever works, we just want to build that consistent reinforcement. Okay, so moving through 4 key takeaways that we have from our goal setting. Goals are important, and yes, particularly during COVID-19, which are still going, goals are always important. But if we don't set the right goals, we can actually go the opposite direction that we want to, and we can lower motivation and lower performance. So, in response to that, set a combination of performance and mastery goals at the appropriate times, of course. And then finally, these goals should be specific and they should be written down so that you are constantly reminded of them. Now, just before I jump on to the next part of the webinar, this is one of our really nice stories about goal setting. And these stories are by no means few and far between in our coaching program, but it really does exemplify the message of this evening. And this is about a student that we had named Jared. And so his parents had us come and run a free consultation with him. And it was pretty clear that Jared was feeling a bit overwhelmed by year 12 and he wasn't too sure how to approach it. Now, the coach running that consultation, someone you might recognize because it was Kane, who's given a few of these webinars, felt that he was really connected with Jared because despite this timid and shy front that he had, Kane could sense that there was this underlying passion and a desire to succeed, but there was just something holding him back, and it was just this slightest bit of apprehension. And so, while Jared was never the type of person to set avoidance goals, he was almost entirely reliant on performance goals. And in those performance goals, they were usually S goals. He didn't really know why he was setting them, which means there were times that were really stressful. There were times when he left things to the last minute, and I'm sure there is a lot of students out there that have felt or are feeling this exact same way, and as coaches, we feel for them. So Kane spent 12 weeks with Jared, helping him build his memory skills, his time management and organization, exam strategies, reading skills, just to name a few. But they also spent a lot of time on this, on exactly what we're talking about right now, and that is goal setting and goal clarification. So they went through the UAC study guide, they looked through the faculty handbooks, and then they found a course at the University of Wollongong that Jared straight away loved. It was a campus that he loved, they looked through the subjects, and something struck a chord, and that was it. And from there, they wrote down Jared's goal ATAR, which had meaning for him. He knew what he wanted to work for. And then they took that goal and they broke it down into short-term performance goals for each one of his subjects. And they also added a number of mastery goals that pointed towards the skills that Jared would need to make sure the rest of Year 12 was as easy as possible. And then what Kane and Jared did was they traced the impact of the sessions over time. And what they could see was there was a tangible shift in Jared's mindset and in the level of his confidence, which you can see on the screen there. And for our coaches, that's the inspiring thing. That's what we love to see. That's what keeps motivating us. Because for those of you who are already invested in this story, and I know by this point when I heard Kane's story, I was certainly invested, Jared got offered an early entry into that very course that he was keen to get into. So while tonight we are mainly looking at the role that you as parents can play, we do have a team of over 100 coaches around the country who are able to help and support in these similar ways if you feel that you need it. If you feel that your child needs a little bit more support with their study skills and their study habits, if they need a bit of a mentor or a confidant, or if you just think that they're going to respond better to these ideas from a peer rather than from mum or dad, please feel free to book in a time in our calendar. It's at the bottom of the page if you're on the Elevate website. Maddie's calendar will be down there. You can pick a time. One of our team members will give you a call back. You can have a chat to see if the program is right for you. If you're on YouTube, that link exists as well. Again, it's in the description. You can find Maddie's calendar, book in a time that's convenient for you, and we'll give you a call to have a chat to see if this is right for you. But for now, onwards and back to you as parents, because I have 4 more practical tips on how we can encourage your children, our students, to set better goals and hopefully get some more motivation as well. So, before we jump into the Q&A, we've got this first tip here, which is about setting avoidance goals. Or rather, what we're trying to avoid is setting avoidance goals. Because that's one of the number one problems we have with students when they're trying to build their motivation. But to fix that problem, we actually need to understand why it exists. Now, we know that students set these avoidance goals because they either don't believe in themselves or they are scared to fail. But why is that the case? And one reason is that we tend to view the world in binary terms. You win or you lose, you're good or you're bad, you're smart or you're dumb. And when we meet students and ask them why top students succeed, most commonly, students will say that the top students are at the top because they are smarter. When students do well, they put it down to being smart. When students do poorly, they put it down to being dumb. And the best example of it is a student who says to themselves, I'm not a math student. And they get a bad result in math and they say, whatever, it doesn't matter. I was never going to do well anyway. And we know that this is inherently just not true. The other problem is that the good/bad binary is exacerbated by the marking system. And let me be abundantly clear here. This is not a reflection on teachers who are doing a phenomenal job of supporting our students, but teachers are inherently time poor. They are marking hundreds of papers. And so often, just to get through their papers before 3 a.m. so they can get some morsel of sleep, they simply have to go tick cross, 11 out of 20. And the problem with that is that there's no feedback. There's nothing to tell these students why they lost their marks or what they did wrong. And more importantly, there's nothing telling their students how to fix their mistakes. So when a student gets their exam back, all they see is the mark. And yes, they might ask themselves, why did I get this result? But with no feedback, they fall upon that simplistic explanation of this is my innate intelligence. So My first tip for parents tonight is focus on the process, not on the output. Don't get hung up and don't let your child get hung up on their marks, because it is likely to lead to them branding themselves as either smart or stupid. And if they do well, they'll think, I'm a natural born genius, and they'll stop putting in effort. And if they do poorly, they'll feel disenfranchised, and therefore there's no point in trying because they're never going to succeed. Instead, we make the entire focus on the process, because that is something that students can change or improve. Because we can all plan better, we can all write better intros, we can all write better topic sentences, etc., etc. And so practically, how do we do this? Well, we use the pre-exam planner that's on the board there. And we split this page into 4 columns. The firstly, we lay out the subject, and then in the second column, we set a goal. Preferably as a percentage, we make it specific, we make it tangible. And then we break that goal down. We write down everything that we need to do to achieve that goal. So for example, it might be, to achieve this goal, I need to do 10 practice questions on trigonometry. Or I need to memorize 15 analytical words that I can sprinkle into my English essay. Or I need to complete my notes. Whatever it is, it all goes down there. Now, if you're not sure about what to put in this column, we get students to ask their teacher. Because I guarantee you that if a teacher has a student who is proactive, that comes up to them at the end of class and says, "Sir, next week in your test, I want to get 82%. What is it that I can do between now and then to get there?" They are always going to be happy to help. There is never a teacher that's going to say no to that. And then finally, in the 4th column, we set due dates for each of those mini tasks so that we can manage our time and stay on track. Now, yes, obviously this planner helps from an organizational perspective, but it also helps to increase a student's self-efficacy for a couple of reasons. By breaking goals into smaller pieces, they are instantly less overwhelming and they are more manageable. But more crucially, what this does is puts emphasis on the plan or the process rather than the goal. Now, if the student achieves their goal, it's not because they're good at the subject, but rather there is a direct causal link between that result and the process that they laid out in their to-do column. Now, of course, students won't always achieve their goal, but in this case, again, the emphasis is on the process. They didn't quite not reach their goal because they are stupid. It's because their plan was insufficient, or it's because it wasn't executed properly. And so while I have labeled this as an exam planner, we can use the exact same principle for assessment tasks, for speeches, for posters, for project work, anything that requires a significant amount of work. And another way of focusing on the process rather than the outcome is to encourage students to get more feedback. So whenever a student receives a mark that they are unhappy with, it's usually all ticks and crosses. And so they should go through that and identify where they lost marks. The easiest way of doing this is either circling or underlining in a colored pen. Then once they do that, they go to their teacher and they ask 2 questions, which you can see on the screen. Firstly, what specifically lost me the marks in this question? And then secondly, what specific solutions can you give me so that I don't lose those marks again? And then while that teacher explains to them the answers to these questions, the student should be taking notes. We encourage them to write down everything the teacher says, because that is a guidebook, that is a walkthrough to never making that same mistake again. And once they have that feedback, students should redo the part of the question where they initially lost those marks. And this part is crucial. Why is this part so crucial? Because if they follow the advice, then it follows that next time their marks should improve. But more psychologically, we are rubbishing the idea of the good-bad binary. And instead we are shifting our focus to the process. Because it proves to us that on the same exercise, we can shift from a bad to a good mark simply by addressing the techniques that we are using. And so to rehash, that's powerful for 2 reasons. Firstly, on the surface level, we fix past mistakes. Good. But secondly, on that deeper level, we help students realize that their success is not a result of their IQ, but rather of their processes, which they have complete control over and they themselves can change. So, as a parent, if you can help them get this right, you should see their grades improve, but also their attitude. Alright, moving over to the second tip, and the aim here is to remove the fear of failure. If students or if your children are not afraid to fail, then you are much more likely to see them setting performance and mastery goals, which are commonly called achievement goals. And we can encourage this by praising and rewarding their efforts, not the results that they accomplish. This is something that you as parents can leverage immediately. And I'll show you how it works in a couple of different scenarios. So in that first scenario there, I know this one seems a little bit counterintuitive, but if a student gets a good mark, despite putting in no effort, we don't celebrate the success, and instead we chastise the lack of effort. And I know that seems a little bit unfair at face value, but the long-term effect is that it embeds a much healthier mindset. Because if we celebrate success when no effort has been put in, then we condition students to believe that they did well because they are smart. And the problem then is that it begins to create a fixed mindset. And then when things go wrong, if the student believes they got good marks because they are smart, the logical leap is that when the marks drop, they must no longer be smart. And that's a really easy mindset for students to be led into, and we want to avoid that. The second scenario is when your child does do well and they worked hard, we still praise the effort, not the result. And it works on the exact same principle as the first scenario. We are focusing on how hard they tried to achieve, not whether they did or didn't. And so it's not a case of, well done, that's such a good mark, but rather, that's so good because you worked hard at it, and it is awesome to see your hard work paying off. And therefore we create this association that their effort is conducive to success, not their natural ability. Equally, when a student works hard and doesn't do well, so scenario 3, we praise the effort. And we encourage them that if they continue on this path, then the results will come. And by focusing on the process and how to improve that, we still ensure that the outcome remains secondary. And that the point of that is we are equipping students with these skills that they can still improve on, and therefore they can get a better mark next time. And finally, similar to scenario 1, but on the other end of the spectrum, if we have a student that puts in no effort and achieves bad results, we focus on the lack of effort. And that way, we can avoid the student concluding that they did poorly because they were not smart or because they were stupid, and again, plan to avoid that fixed mindset. Now, if anyone in the world has mastered this effort over results principle, it's Barcelona Football Club. They have a training academy called La Masia, and it's responsible for training a whole bunch of players, but one big name is Lionel Messi. And they recognized that a big threat to their junior players' growth and development was their fear of failing and of making mistakes. And thus, they wouldn't put in effort into learning new things because they were scared. They feared that if they tried something and got it wrong, they might concede a goal and they'd let their team down. And so when they played these games, they stuck to the basics because they were comfortable. But of course, that's not how champions are born. So La Masia made 2 big changes, and you can see them there. The first one, no scores in matches until all the players were age 16, or until you make that 16 age group. So, if a player attempted a dribble or a new move from training, it just didn't matter if they stuffed it up and conceded a goal, because scores didn't matter, improvement did. And secondly, the parents were banned from yelling anything but support from the sideline. So if they criticized anyone, or even if they yelled instructions, they were banned from the ground. And their realization is one that is key to all parents, and that is be careful what you reward. Because if we only reward wins, then people are scared to lose. And that fear of losing will stop people from taking risks. It'll stop them from trying new things, and therefore it'll stop them from truly developing. Alright, moving into tip number 3, we are again looking to address this fixed mindset. And here we're looking at it in the terms of a negative feedback loop. We want to break any negative feedback loop where students stop trying because they don't expect to succeed. And just quickly for everyone with the chat box at home, do you have a child like this? Do you have a child who has just stopped trying because they don't think it's worth continuing? If so, please drop a yes in the chat. And I'm sure there is going to be hundreds and hundreds of yeses that Maddie and Rob are going to feed straight through to me. And if that is you, then it's going to be really important for you. And here, we can actually learn a lot from gaming. And yes, I know I said it. It's probably become a bit taboo, and I won't mention the console names for fear of retribution. However, for those of you logged on right now, for some of you, the reason that you're here might be because you are looking to motivate your child to get them off their gaming console and do some work instead. And there is a reason that these games are so addictive. And it's based on the principle of leveling up. If you've ever played a game on the computer or an iPhone, wherever it is, then you'll know how it works. And so let's consider a game like Tetris that everyone knows. So it begins with an easy level, the bricks move slowly, they give you the easy shapes, and generally you beat the first level, which provides you with instant gratification. And this instant gratification causes your body to release particular neurotransmitters like endorphins and serotonin, and these make you feel good. And then you get presented with a new level, with the promise of more feel-good neurotransmitters. Your body then produces dopamine in the anticipation of that reward. Dopamine being the major neurotransmitter that drives motivation. And so the production of dopamine puts you in a state of action where your resilience and your tenacity are increased. And whilst in this state, you are constantly engaged, you are motivated to continue, which is why it is so hard to put these games down. Now, on the flip side, let's just imagine if games weren't designed this way. Imagine if, in the first 10 seconds, the boss character flies onto the screen, kills your character instantly, and you lose. And then you do it again, 10 seconds, boss character flies on, kills your character, you lose. And then the same a third and a fourth time. Are you going to continue after that? Will you keep playing this game? Of course not. Because in the Tetris example, or in the first one, you get addicted because you are conditioned to succeed, and that feels good. In the second example, you are conditioned to fail, which is incredibly demotivating. What's the point of playing a game if you're going to lose every 10 seconds? And this is exactly how students feel when they get knocked back time and time again at school. If they fail 5 maths tests in a row, then they're going to start to feel like their efforts are pointless. And thus, they're going to set avoidance goals just to get through, just to keep others happy, when psychologically they're giving up. That's pretty much they've already quit. So, as parents, the first important takeaway from this slide is that if you see your child slipping into that process of being conditioned to fail, intervene as early as possible. If your child falls short twice in a row, jump in any way to break that loop, to break that circuit. And if we take it back to gaming, you want to give them the skills to level up before they meet the next boss, which is going to be the next test. And so one way you can do this is to bring in a subject tutor, or if their deficiencies are in their study skills and not necessarily content knowledge, you could leverage one of our coaches. And that's not the only way you can do it. You don't have to bring in an external party all the time. If it's easier, you could leverage a friend or a sibling who's already doing really well. You could work alongside them yourself, perhaps. You can sign them up to receive online study guides. Whatever it is, you know your child much better than I do. But you just want to break that negative feedback loop early and stop them from falling into the state of conditioned failure. The other thing that really helps here is setting work of varying difficulty levels. That means start easy. So your child basically has a chance to experience early success before going on to some of those more tricky tasks. I'm sure we've all done that before. We start with the easier task and then after that, everything seems a little bit easier. And more specifically, we love to use this concept when we talk about practice papers. And as a very quick aside, if your child ever says that they have nothing to do, then you can always point them towards practice papers. But the way that we encourage students to do that is we start open book, open time. That is, you have your notes out, you have your books out. If there's a question you don't know the answer to, or if you're struggling a bit, that's okay. You look it up and then answer the question, which means we have eliminated the option of failure. And then once students feel a bit more comfortable, then they can go to closed book, open time. So we encourage them to start to try and do some remembering, but there's no pressure to think fast. And then finally, once they've acquired a few more skills, once it gets a little bit easier, then we go to exam conditions. And as you can see here, each step is a level up. First, it's open book, open time. Then they level up to closed book, open time. And then they level up to exam conditions. And each time they feel that they are improving and making genuine progress, which of course they are. So, to recap, this process is to ensure that they do not become conditioned to failure, so that they can see themselves continually improving and that they are more likely to stay motivated to keep going. Alright, my final tip for tonight is to make all conversations and all celebrations about improvement. And there are 2 parts to this. The first one is that we are focusing on all improvements, even if they're small. Because if you have a child who's getting, say, in the 50s, and they are pushing for, or they're being pushed to get in the 90s, even getting a mark of 70 is going to feel like a daunting and impossible task. So instead, we discuss lifting that 50 to a 55, which is something that's close enough to feel realistic, but large enough that it's actually worth working towards. And then secondly, when these wins occur, we celebrate like crazy. And this is not the usual scenario for students, because often students feel like praise only comes when we get 90 plus, or we get A's, or we get our goal ATAR. But honestly, celebrate these small improvements like it's Christmas time. And why do we do this? Well, we are trying to trigger those neurotransmitters that we just discussed, the feel-good chemicals, endorphins, serotonin, dopamine. Remember, the way that the game designers hook your children is by triggering those neurotransmitters. When they finish a level, there's a massive celebration. There's fireworks on the screen, there's music playing, the controller vibrates. It is a full sensory experience. And if we want to pull them away from those games, then we need to do the exact same thing. So we celebrate the improvement in a way that gives that same endorphin hit. Because if you do, the next neurotransmitter to hit the body is going to be dopamine. And remember that dopamine puts us in that state that increases resilience, increases tenacity, and motivates students because they will simply just want more. So, how do we implement this? My suggestion is something like this, which is a visual input tracking system, like a graph. Stick it in your home, somewhere that everyone can see it. On the y-axis is their marks, and on the x-axis is the number of times that a student has practiced that skill. That skill could be essay writing, doing practice papers, whatever their mastery goal is centered around, it's all there. And each time they practice that skill, they move across the graph. And each time they receive a mark, even if it's a draft, but of course can be an assessment as well, we plot it on the graph. And if we can see that that line has gone up, even if it's only 11 out of 20 or 13 out of 20, we celebrate like crazy. Because remember, we want to condition that endorphin hit so that they are eager to keep going. And over time, students can look at this graph and they can see that as a direct result of the amount of effort that they are putting in, they are clearly improving. And if this is done well, and I recognize that initially it is likely to be a parent driving this, but if it is done well over time, students will become conditioned to that constant improvement, and they will be the ones driving it and always plotting their results as they come back. So, just to recap those 4 points before we jump into the Q&A part of tonight, because I don't want to keep you too long for the evening. My 4 tips were: focus on the process, not the outcome. We looked at that pre-exam planner. We keep the conversations about the processes. We don't focus on the outcome. And thus, we set our goals around those processes too. Secondly, reward effort over everything else. Thirdly, break the failure conditioning process. Early intervention and starting easy and then making study incrementally harder over time. And then finally, celebrate all incremental improvements. We celebrate like crazy every time there is a smaller bit of progress made, we celebrate. And we can do that, of course, by looking at that results tracker to stimulate that endorphin hit, just like those video games do. Okay, that is just about all the time we'll have for tonight in terms of the motivation content. I am going to jump into a few questions in the Q&A, but before that, just 2 things I want to mention. The first one is, like I said at the start, we will be running another webinar. It's going to be in 2 weeks' time, so February 24th, 6 p.m. And in that one, we are going to be focusing on keeping students on track when it comes to managing their time. So if you have a child who procrastinates, who leaves work to the last minute, struggles to focus and get started, doesn't prioritize, gets overwhelmed, we are going to be breaking all of that down. We're going to give some strategies, we're going to look at some frameworks, some templates to help students get organized and to maintain that consistent work rate. So like I said, there is a registration link. If you're on our website, the Elevate website, it should be just below the video. You can type in your email address, and as soon as that one's set up, you will know. Of course, if you're on YouTube, just in the description, there is a link to also get to that registration box as well. And finally, our goal tonight is to empower you as parents to help your children. We want you to have these conversations with them. But like I mentioned, if you feel that your well-intentioned advice is falling on deaf ears, remember we do have our coaching programs available. We offer a free initial session for anyone who'd like to give it a go. So if you want to have a chat and see whether coaching might be right for your child, then you can absolutely book in a time to have a chat with one of our team members. Like I said before, Maddie's calendar is at the bottom of the page on our website, or again, if you're on YouTube, there should be a link to her calendar as well. Book in a time that's convenient for you. We are always happy to have a chat. I will admit the calendar is filling up fast, but the option is there for you. For now, let's have a look at some of those questions that are coming through. Wow, okay, there's a few good questions coming through. Give me just one moment so I can have a sip of water, and then we will absolutely answer those. All right, sorry, I was also just reading one without having the microphone on. So, from Furlong, my child who is age 16 wants to spend every spare minute with his friends, skating, skateboarding, scootering and playing basketball. He thinks schoolwork should be limited to school hours. How do I get him to take any interest in homework? Much of which is to finish work he has started in school and has been asked to finish at home. He is not interested at all, sees no value in it. Yeah, absolutely furlong. There is perhaps a pyramid of motivation that I would assign. And what we find is that lots of students fall into kind of the lower motivation. So motivation goes from rock bottom all the way to the top in this pyramid. And of course, there's less students up the top that are so highly motivated. What we find is that as you go up the pyramid, there is this interesting correlation of something I was talking about before, which is goal clarity. So students that have higher clarity around their goal also have higher motivation. And so my first tip, and I will admit I don't know your child as well as you do, but my first tip would be just to take some time out and ask your child what they think they might want to do after year 12. And maybe it's the fact they have no plan. And I completely understand. If I didn't know what I wanted to do at the end of year 12, then I wouldn't see the point in studying because, I get it. School can be a little bit boring at times, and we can all admit that. But as soon as a student has this kind of light at the end of the tunnel and knows what they want to do and knows that a little bit of hard work will get them there, that's when they put aside that feeling of, I don't want to do it because it's boring, and I'd like to do it because I know it's going to get me somewhere that I actually want to be. So that is my first suggestion, is to just take some time, start thinking about maybe some goals, and run through those university faculty handbooks. I think those are an absolute gold mine for motivating students into thinking about what they might want to do afterwards. The second thing I'll say is that sometimes students do want to do work, although they might not admit it, but doing schoolwork can be really daunting, particularly if it's really mounting up. And as you would all know, if there's lots on your plate, it is even harder to be motivated because we're already overwhelmed. And so having a few of these other study skills, time management, note-taking, exam planning, if you know that your tasks are going to be easy and they're already set out, then it's easy to get to the desk and just smash them out. If you have no idea what you're doing when you sit at the desk, then that can also be really daunting. So that's maybe two different things that we can try. Margaret, what if the child doesn't know what they'll do at uni or in life yet? What are some examples of goals we can set? Absolutely, this happens all the time, and absolutely there are students who are in year 12 that still don't know what they want to do at uni, in life, and that's totally okay. Also, more particularly if year 7, year 8, year 9, I never expect students to know exactly what they want to do. Great if they do, but that's not always the case. And so instead we start to think about other goals. And in particular, we start thinking about mastery goals. So let's say this scenario is you've got someone in year 8 or year 9. What skills do you think you'll need at the end of year 9 to make this life easy for you? Would you like to spend more time playing Xbox or skating? And if so, what are some study-related skills that you might need in order to give yourself more time to do those things? Same thing for year 12. If you want to go traveling in a gap year next year, where do you want to go? How long do you want to go for? All right, well, in that case, if you want to go travel in, Europe for 6 months, how much money are you going to need? How are you going to get your job? And then all of a sudden, there's this awesome activity at the end, traveling across Europe, assuming we can go, traveling across Europe for 6 months. And they have this tangible and specific goal of, let's say, I need to make $10,000. Therefore, they need to get a job. So they need to practice their CV skills. They need to practice their interviewing skills. And then maybe you can start to see that going through year 12 and having good time management skills and getting good results in your classes or doing well in English might help you write your CV. And then all of a sudden we have this different goal that is spurring them along to get to somewhere they really do want to be. And you can look anywhere. Like I said, you can look for, going traveling, you can look for TAFE, you can look for colleges, whatever it is, just opening up that conversation is another good place to have goals. All right. How does this work / what type of goals can kids do now in their second week of year 7 where life is majorly different from being in primary school? Yeah, good. All right. So I'll focus now kind of on the other end in the younger years. And again, I think it's these mastery goals. What is it that you want to achieve from year 7, year 8, and year 9? And very often I'll encourage students to think about, do you just want to have a fun year 7 whereby you get all your work done and you have time to hang out with your mates? And I think that's a very realistic and a very attainable and a very enticing goal for a younger level student to have. And so from that means they need to develop some good mastery skills, some time management skills, they need to get their work done on time. And so it's not so focused around grades and marks if they don't want it to be, but more about actually getting work done efficiently. All right, let's see what else we have here. From Lenny or Lena, I'm sorry if I haven't pronounced that right, but in focusing on the process, how is that possible when as parents we don't always get told / know what is expected and therefore we do not see the outcome until the result is posted from the teacher? Yeah, absolutely. Really common question and a really classic scenario. And I think probably the best thing that we can try here is try and stay in contact with your children as much as you can about all the assessments they have. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to know when the due date for every assessment is, or what the rubric is for every assessment. And yeah, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to know those, because we can still be focusing on processes all the way through the year, regardless of whether we have assessments coming up or not. And again, we're going to be looking at those performance goals versus those mastery goals. Obviously, it's ideal if we know when everything's due and what the actual goal is. But if you see your child working at their desk and playing on their phone for half an hour of a 1 hour study session, then that's probably an inefficient process. And so without knowing what they're doing or if they have an assessment coming up, we can still focus on these different types of study management techniques, such as, maybe it would be better if you put your phone away for half an hour, smashed out that work, because I can see you can do it in 30 minutes, but it's taking you 60 or 90 minutes just because you keep checking your phone. Why don't you chuck it on Do Not Disturb, practice that, do it for 15 minutes, then check your phone. Do it for 15 minutes, then check your phone. And then we'll try to get to half an hour, and then we'll try to get to 45 minutes. And eventually they can see that they can leave themselves longer and longer leaving their phone away and getting work done. Now, of course, they're going to see that they're getting work done. But if we take it a step further, maybe we can make it a bit of a game. If you can, we'll put it on a visual input tracking chart. We'll start with how long can I leave my phone before I have to check it while studying. And for every study session you do, you see how long you can leave it. First session, it's 5 minutes, and then it gets to 7 minutes, and then it gets to 10 minutes. And this student can see that they're getting better and better at leaving their phone away, and they're probably getting more work done. All right, I think that's just about everything that we have time for this evening. Thank you very much. We've gone a little bit past 7 o'clock. But thank you very much for joining me tonight. Like I said, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another webinar on time management and organization. Everyone have a wonderful night. Thanks for joining us yet again, and we will see you soon.